Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, is the central tenet of Aleister Crowley's religion, Thelema, a Greek word meaning will, with a capital W. This capital W differentiates the word will, as it is defined within the religion or the philosophy of Crowley, from the lowercase w will, which is the more human, or maybe it's better to say desirous or a sensory will, which is something altogether different than the will upon which his philosophy is constructed. In Greek, modern Greek anyway, the phrase thelema is rare. It is not commonly used for many of the definitions or communications of what generally people talk about when they're discussing will. In fact, thelema is something that it's closely akin to, very loosely, an American phrase, shit happens. And it refers to inevitability of events. Thelema, broken down according to modern Greek, is a way of saying it is the will of God. One such example that comes to mind is I had a friend about 20 years ago who got a phone call and was upset. A distant cousin had died, and the accident was kind of astonishing. The accidental circumstances surrounding the death. There was a young man. He had been riding a snowmobile at a high rate of speed and ran into a tree. He, of course, was ejected from the snowmobile, landed on his back in the snow, and appeared fine. Went to remove his helmet, and after removing his helmet, a branch fell from the tree, stabbed him through the eye, and killed him. This obviously was his will to pass in that moment. Not just his will, but as thelema is used in Greek, it is the will of God. So it's not a desire. It's not a thing we want to do with our lives in order to earn money. It's not a form of hedonistic, sensory indulgence. It is strictly finding that which in us that is our purpose. And I don't really like to put it this way either, because it tends to lead into the goal idea of will, which is not what will stands for in thelema. But in the Greek, thelema means an inevitable occurrence that is God's will. Basically, we couldn't have stopped this. This happened because this was going to happen. So, in Crowley's terms, we have to understand a little of the background of his yoga. But first, I'd like to speak on a little bit about what I've discussed there in terms of the modern usage of thelema as a phrase in Greek, in that I'm going to use the word God quite a bit in discussing this, and I want to clarify and make certain that it is understood that I use the word God in the understanding that God is a word. It is nothing more, nothing less. All of us, it is such a loaded term. God is such a loaded term with so many ideologies, so much baggage, but that is not the way that I'm going to be using it here. I personally grew up without religion, completely without religion. I went to churches twice as a kid. I hated it. I had no connection with that kind of life. To me, growing up in the 70s, my ideas of God were based on what I learned from watching Star Wars, to be honest. The Force, this all pervading, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent force that could be aligned with in order to succeed in my endeavors, if those endeavors were also aligned with this central energy, this vibration, this purpose. So when I do use the word God, I'm not talking about a man on a cloud. I'm not talking about a man risen from the grave that was crucified on a cross. I'm not talking about any deity. I'm not talking about anything else. God is just the word I use for that thing which is at the core of everything, that thing of which all that we may experience and all with which we may interact is merely a manifestation of its energy, a small part of it, if you will. So Crowley spent some time in India, and this is apparent in his system of AA, which is a system of mystical attainment based on the scientific method. Essentially, his idea of true will was de-anthropomorphizing God, and so that it's no longer viewed as a person, and turning it into the term true will or Thelema. So that it's not some thing, some figure that we're worshiping. It's the thing at the center of ourselves that manifests us in order that there is life, that there is whatever the purpose is. So he spent a lot of time in India, and the Vedic knowledge, the Vedic literature, it really does not... It does not contradict any of Crowley's teachings, from what I've found, and I find that his time there and his time spent within the systems of Patanjali, of studying Vivekananda, from studying yoga and working the 8 limbs from the Patanjali's system, really informed his creation of his system, which was basically just the Golden Dawn system of Western esotericism. He took the Vedic system of yoga and he united these, and rightfully so, in my opinion. So understanding this word will is essential for unifying all of Crowley's teachings. It helps you get his jokes and helps you not be fooled by his blinds. If you can understand what he's talking about, if you can look at his life and take a step back to look at what he created and left as his legacy, you see that the whole purpose is what was being taught in the East, in India, in the Vedic literatures. And it is essentially a breaking apart of all of the unnecessary, all of the things that have collected upon us in our consciousness within the world. It is an achieving of clarity, removing all of the obstacles that we place upon ourselves and that our world places upon us, so that we can return to that center, that place where we're constantly performing our true wills. So this also agrees with the idea that anything we are doing in some way is our will. But there's a matter of how much how much pain you want to go through, how much do you want to stray from your direct path and create hardships for yourself in order to accomplish what you need to accomplish in this lifetime. So Crowley wrote a little bit about will in chapter 15 of the Book of Lies. And that chapter is called The Gun Barrel. It elucidates the number 15. It's basically a chapter that's talking about as the comment says, talking about essentially the phallus as the will, but in that comment, it's a little will. Little w will, but mirroring that with the greater will, the capital W. And it starts out with something that I think will align with what the Vedic literatures are teaching about yoga, and that is the first line, if I may, is, "Mighty and erect is this will of mine, this pyramid of fire whose summit is lost in heaven. Upon it I have burned the corpse of my desires." Now, if you think about what is being taught in yoga, in karma yoga especially, such as in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 5, we have Krishna speaking to Arjuna, describing some of the goals of the yoga. And the quote here, if I may, is, "The yogis, while giving up attachment, perform actions with their body, senses, mind, and intellect, only for the purpose of self-purification." And then it goes to follow on the next verse, "Offering the results of all activities to God, the karma yogis attain everlasting peace, whereas those who, being impelled by their desires, work with a selfish motive, become entangled because they are attached to the fruits of their actions." And this follows in Crowley talking about, "Thou hast no right but to do thy will." And then later, he's also stated, "For pure will, unassuaged of purpose, is every way perfect." I think this is reasonable evidence, and there is a lot more, but that this will is exactly what is meant in the Bhagavad Gita by God. In the Bhagavad Gita, you have Krishna speaking, and he is an earthly manifestation of God, according to the story. In one of several incarnations of the one God. This is not a Vedic lecture, so I won't go too much into the paradoxes of the many gods and the one God within the Bhagavad Gita or within the Hindu religion, but it's there and it reasons out. You'll just have to trust me on that for this time. Maybe another lecture on that at another time. So these things are referred to as self. This true will is self. In all of these various mystical teachings. But it's not self that is the ego. It is not the I. Whereas Crowley in the Gun Barrel verifies this when he says, "I am not I. I am but an hollow tube to bring down fire from heaven." This is kind of painting the picture of what is supposed to happen when one discovers their true will. Just as one discovers God in religions. It's not like you're without God all of your life and you're doing these tasks or these chores or these ordeals in order so that God comes out of hiding. And, it's like like a peekaboo fashion or something. It's not that way. It's that you discover God within you. You discover the true will within you. So it is much less about finding something or attaining something as it is about becoming conscious of what is there, becoming conscious of reality, of true nature. And it's not an easy task. That's why Crowley built an entire system teaching others to do that in a scientific way, because it has been a problem that has plagued humanity since time immemorial, all the way back. People teach mystical teachings. It gets turned into a religion. Everything gets convoluted. People expose it and exploit it for power. And all, as they say, the spirit has left the letter. It's no longer the mystical teaching. It's something else. So AA was an attempt by Crowley to circumvent all of that. Some ways he did that was by not allowing money. He turned it into basically a reflection of the guru system, a guru-disciple system in yoga, by just having one person who has walked the path that can answer some questions for you, because, ideally they've done it fairly recently and they remember some of those things. So, one of these things that I've discussed is the senses, and it comes up again and again and again in Bhagavad Gita, in Crowley talking about desires, which is kind of problematic because there's a lot of hedonism in Crowley stuff. But I think where the misconceptions lie is that Crowley encourages one to do what they feel guided to do, what they feel, essentially to live out your desires until you're rid of them. So one pitfall that I see with new Thelemites is the not understanding self, the nature of self. They don't understand the self as the will, as God, and put all of those pieces together within the mysteries of Crowley's works. So they tend to worship the bodies and the organs of the senses. You take wine. Well, that's all we have to do is we take wine. That's all we have to do is have sex, or invoke these pleasures, these sense pleasures. That's all we need to do, and we're doing our will, and that's not quite it. This leads to an exaltation of the ego, because you're getting more and more compressed into that sensory environment, as is taught within yoga. You're misled that way. Your intellect becomes impure, is what they say in Bhagavad Gita, or what Sri Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita. That if you're constantly just feeding and paying attention to the senses, you're lost. You get absorbed in this gratification, this self motivation, and all of these things, which then separate your consciousness from will. You're then putting your consciousness into the senses. One way that Swami Mukundananda had described this is that you have a horse-drawn chariot, and all of the component parts are necessary for this horse-drawn chariot to be that. But he related, saying that the horses were the senses, and the reins were the mind, the driver is the intellect, and the passenger, who is paying for the ride, who's sitting in the back and obviously is the main director, is the soul. And this attention to the senses and emphasis on sense gratification being a priority is, as he said, the same as letting the horses lead the chariot. Not having the soul, the passenger tell the driver where they're going. Driver maybe falls asleep, not using the reins. The horses just go where they want. And that's kind of what it's like if you take will to be your sense desires. It's not the case. And that's evident in Crowley's AA system, of which Liber E is a big part. And the first thing Crowley has one do, or one of the first things, is to control the body. And that's the same with the eight limb path of yoga. I believe it's Ashtanga yoga. But you have to control the body. And the reason you have to control the body is because you have to control the senses, because the senses then will release the emotions, the mental aspects of the self. So then one can learn to control the mind. And once one has gained control of the mind, you control the intellect, which is the maybe the motivating or inspiration of the mind. And that's a lot of what the yoga that Crowley would have studied and mastered in India is about. Purifying. A lot of these, the quote I'd mentioned talked about self-purification, purifying the intellect to receive the quote-unquote divine inspiration. In other words, to be in contact with the true self, so that then you can trust your actions, your spontaneous motivations, any of this to be in line with your true will, because you have that purified intellect, because your mind is controlled, and because your senses, your mind are subservient to these higher purposes. The ego is no longer driving. So also the AA neophyte is told to be chaste and reverent toward the body, but this is a vehicle of initiation. This is not the self. So being reverent to the body means, okay, this, it's like you would take care of your car so that you can get to work or get to where you're going. You, for a neophyte, have to be chaste and reverent to get the vehicle of initiation to the next step. Nowhere is in Crowley's writing is the body the object of devotion. It's a tool, just as he would have learned in India. So again, this true will then can be understood to be God. And in the Thelemic system, if one entertains that perspective and rereads everything and restudies everything, I feel confident that you will see that is the case. That is what we're talking about when we say true will. It's the same thing that not everyone would use the word God in that correct or that not in that way. But that is what I think when the word God is translated in these mystical writings, that's typically what it's talking about. It's talking about, as I said earlier, the Force from Star Wars, which can be used or misused. And misusing it isn't necessarily the worst thing. I think I kind of operate under the concept that souls go through many, many lifetimes, such as they do in Hinduism. And some actually need to misuse this in order to learn the ways that their soul needs to go. These can be painful lessons, but that's kind of part of it. It's like like any truly beautiful sculpture has to start with a mass of something, and at first you're not presenting a beautiful sculpture. You're hammering and chiseling and creating destruction and creating, if it was done on something that was sentient, it would create pain. But there is friction, which is another way of saying pain. And that's how you get the sculpture. Eventually, you chisel away enough, you get the desired image. So this is kind of what the AA is about, and this is kind of what Crowley's Thelema is about. It's about chiseling away at ourselves and coming to a point where we can discover our relationship with the true will, or with God, as it might be called. So hopefully using the loaded term is starting to become a bit comfortable, because it's really important to do so as I align these things with the Vedic literatures, which is kind of the work that I'm doing and that I hope to bring as theory, and as hopefully a way to tie these things together for some folks who are just starting out on the path, or have maybe not had all the success they want in doing these things. So when we say, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," that's what we're saying. We're saying to do that, and only that is the goal. It's to get to a point where we trust that our inspirations and our desires are leading us on that path. And that's not by convincing ourselves that, doing these selfish things and, screwing people over or whatever else we're doing is the ideal. That's not it at all. It's to get to that point, and in the AA system, that is called the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of our holy guardian angel, where we know what the will is. We know when that voice is the voice that we're being inspired by, versus a momentary passing of sense desire or something like that. We learn to distinguish our sense desires from base sense desires to these more elevated and willful sense desires for perhaps higher purposes. And it really takes a resignation that we're not going to understand all of the entire machinations of the universe. We're not going to see the biggest picture. We're not even maybe going to see the picture beyond ourselves. But we have to learn when that occurrence, that voice again, that angel within us, or the God within us, is guiding us to do something, to act in some way, or to not act, or anything. I mean, even acts that we may not think that would be things that we would do ourselves, something that may be not aligned with, say, the commandments or the dogmas of our religion, but is necessary for the unfoldment of our true will in our lives. So, yes, I agree in some respects that not every Thelemite has to seek these mystical attainments. Not yet anyway, not in this life, but I also believe, and I think Crowley had stated as such, that once you're on the path, that is where you end up. I know in AA we say that once you've come to a certain point, you're then set on the path. You can leave the order in the outer, the people that are trying to help you along the path, but you can't leave the path. You're either going to eventually end up, as it says, in the city of the pyramids or in the lonely towers of the abyss. And even then, I think that when one ends up in the lonely towers of the abyss, all they're doing is setting themselves back another however many years or lifetimes before they will eventually get to the city of the pyramids. They're just making things really hard on themselves. And I know that we've all done that. I certainly know I have. Definitely not taken the straight path for my entire life, but hopefully I'm getting better at that now. So Thelema is about discovering this true path, this straight path within ourselves, and doing our best to stick to it. And as long as we're doing our best, as the Bhagavad Gita was saying, dedicating all of our actions to God, exactly synonymous with that idea, then we are living as Thelemites. Whereas if we're just feeding the senses and going about our lives and saying, I'm doing my will, look, because I'm doing stuff, that's not necessarily, you're not really getting it. So just wanted to clarify, I wanted to have a little reintroduction to Thelema, because I'm not sure all of this information has been presented in this way, and this is the way I understand it. I hope it's been helpful. I hope the word God was not too offensive. I don't find it as offensive because, like I said, I haven't been beat over the head with religion or that word. It's just a word in my mind, but it signifies an idea that I think is exactly synonymous with true will and what Crowley intended by that. And you'll see Crowley's usage of that language as well, especially if you're reading the Liber 65. Adonai is another one that is also in line with that. And as he says, before Adeptus Minor, before the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of one's holy guardian angel, the true will is that. That is the point of everything, is to attain that knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. So in one sense, Thelemites are not required for these to reach these mystical attainments, but it would be very difficult to argue that one is a Thelemite and does not care if they attain to the knowledge and conversation of their holy guardian angel. However one understands that phrase or that attainment, there is some aspect of every Thelemite that is seeking that attainment. Anyway, so that would be my impression of this topic. I hope you've enjoyed listening. I look forward to any comments or any suggestions you may have. I would like to do this on at least a monthly basis. We'll see how it works out, how this recording sounds. But yeah, that is my take on what is Thelema. So I hope you all do well and are happy and joyous in the accomplishment of your true wills. And I look forward to talking with you again soon.